9 years of marriage. Tell me, what exactly have you contributed? What do you want me to say? That is exactly the problem. You never say anything worth hearing. Julian, I built everything you have ever touched, every room, every name. You exist because of me, then say what you want to say. Beg me to keep her, or get out. Julian Caruso believed he understood power. He had spent 9 years making certain Camille understood it too. Accounts he controlled, staff who answered only to him, decisions she was never asked to make. When he issued his ultimatum in front of every man in the room who owed him something, he was not asking a question. He was reminding her of her place. What he failed to account for was how she received those words. Not as a threat, but as the permission she had been quietly waiting for. How do you threaten a woman who already has a plan? The night Julian Caruso issued his ultimatum, there were 43 people in the room. Camille counted them afterward, not because the number mattered, but because she needed something concrete to hold on to while her husband's words moved through the air. Like smoke, slow and deliberate and designed to choke. 43 people who watched, who said nothing, who lifted their glasses and waited to see what a wife would do when her husband reminded the entire room that she belonged to him. Julian had chosen the venue carefully. He always did. The house on the North Shore had hosted heads of organizations, city officials, and men who understood that power was not declared, but demonstrated. And tonight he intended to demonstrate it. What Julian had never understood about Camille was that she had been raised to notice exactly what people chose not to say. Her mother had taught her that. The silence in a room told you more than the conversation, and the silence in that room, thick with expensive cologne and inherited loyalty, told Camille everything she needed to know about who these men were and what they would remember in the morning. She had been standing near the fireplace when Julian called her to the center of the room. Not asked, called. The way a man calls something he owns. She crossed the marble floor without rushing, and Julian watched her with the particular satisfaction of a person who has never once considered that the world might not perform on cue. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that photographed well at fundraisers and made prosecutors uncomfortable in depositions. He had built something real. She had always acknowledged that. But the thing he built had required him to make himself enormous, and the only way to stay enormous was to ensure that everyone nearby remained small. That had been the architecture of their marriage for nearly a decade, not cruelty in the cinematic sense. No raised fists, no shattered plates. It was quieter than that, and quieter things are harder to leave because they give you nothing obvious to point to. Julian controlled the accounts. He selected the staff. He decided which invitations they accepted and which causes bore their name. When they attended dinners, he would gesture toward her and make the kind of offhand joke that left a mark without leaving evidence. Something about how Camille's greatest financial achievement was knowing which direction to swipe a credit card. The table would laugh. Camille would smile because she had learned that smiling was faster than explaining, and explaining cost her things she was not ready to spend. What no one in any of those rooms knew, what Julian himself had no idea about, was that 4 years earlier, Camille had made a decision, not a dramatic one, not the kind forged in a moment of fury after some unforgivable scene. It was quieter than that, too. She had been sitting in the library of their house on a Sunday morning, reading a contract Julian had asked her to sign, and she had understood with a calm that surprised her that she was signing her own name onto paper that reduced her. She signed it. Then she walked upstairs, opened her laptop, and sent an email to Marina Reeves. A woman she had known before Julian, a woman who had built a consulting firm from nothing, and who understood the distance between a woman's name on a contract and a woman's name on a deed. The email was 3 sentences. By Tuesday they had spoken. By the following spring a company existed under Camille's maiden name, and Julian had never thought to look. That was the thing about men who believed their wives were decorative. They stopped paying attention to what the decoration was doing. The company was called Claire Storm, her mother's first name folded into the maiden name she had set aside when she married. Marina ran the public face of it. Camille ran the architecture. They worked in windows of time that Julian's schedule left open. Early mornings, afternoon gaps when he was in meetings, the hours between the last guest leaving and the house going quiet. Camille had always been described as someone who kept herself busy. Julian took credit for that, too, occasionally telling associates that he made sure his wife was never bored. He had no idea what she was busy doing. By the time Julian called her to the center of that room, Claire's Storm had been operating for 4 years. There was a real estate portfolio in 3 cities. There were clients who knew Marina's face and Camille's thinking. There was a penthouse in Streeterville that Camille had purchased through a holding structure so clean it had taken her months to construct. There were accounts Julian could not see because they did not share a last name with him. None of this was visible on the woman standing in the middle of the marble floor in a black dress, looking at her husband while he prepared to perform for his associates. Julian was in an expansive mood that evening. He often was when he had an audience. He had poured 2 fingers of scotch and was holding the glass loosely the way powerful men hold things when they want to suggest they could put them down at any moment. He addressed Camille in front of the room the way he had been addressing her in private for years, except that here the cruelty had an audience, which meant it had a purpose beyond just the 2 of them. He asked her what she thought she would do if the accounts were closed tomorrow. He told the room she had never negotiated a contract, never managed a business, never earned anything that did not carry his name attached to it. He turned it into something almost funny, the way he always did so that anyone who objected would seem like they lacked a sense of humor. Camille answered him calmly. She said she would figure it out. Julian laughed because it was exactly the answer he expected from someone he believed had no idea what figuring it out actually required. He told the room she would last a week. 1 week without him, before she came back to whatever table he chose to set for her. The room responded the way rooms respond to powerful men making jokes with the kind of laughter that is really just agreement, the kind that costs nothing and commits to nothing, and evaporates the moment the room empties. But something had shifted. Camille recognized it even if Julian did not. He was not simply being cruel, he was testing something. The difference was small, but it mattered. Cruelty for its own sake was something she had learned to navigate. Testing meant he was uncertain of something, and a man who tests his wife in public is a man who has begun somewhere beneath the performance to feel something he cannot name. She filed that information away, the same way she filed everything, without revealing that she had noticed it. Then came the evening Julian chose to make it permanent. The gathering at the North Shore house was not unusual in its composition. The same circle of men who had been circling Julian for years, bound by money or obligation or both. What was unusual was the mood Julian arrived in, something tight behind his eyes, something that needed release. Camille had seen it before and knew how to be invisible when it appeared, but Julian did not want her invisible that night. He wanted her visible for a very specific reason. He called her into the center of the room. He said, in a voice that was almost pleasant, that he had been thinking about what she contributed to this marriage. He listed what she did not do. He listed it in front of every man in that room, and his voice never rose because men like Julian knew that calm was more frightening than volume. Then he said the thing he had apparently been building toward, the thing he believed would establish, once and for all, the full shape of what he owned. He told her to beg him to stay married to her. If she could give him one reason, one real reason, he might consider it. If she could not, the door was open. He was smiling when he said it. Not broadly, just enough. Camille looked at him for a moment. The room was very still. She said she needed a few minutes and excused herself, and Julian nodded the way a man nods when he already knows how a scene ends. He assumed she was gathering herself. He assumed she was upstairs working through the terror of a woman who had nowhere to go, calculating the cost of an apology and deciding it was worth paying. He refreshed his glass. He made a quiet remark to the man beside him. He waited. Upstairs, Camille moved with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this. 2 bags she had kept packed for 3 weeks. The items that were hers in any meaning of the word beyond Julian's definition of it. A manila envelope she had carried home 6 days ago from a meeting with her attorney, already signed, the dissolution paperwork in order. Every asset correctly documented under the name he had not thought to monitor. She had not packed in anger. She had packed the way she had built the last 4 years methodically, without sentiment, keeping her hands steady, because there was still work to be done. She came down the staircase at a pace that was neither fast nor slow. She crossed the room. She set the envelope on the table nearest the door. She picked up her coat from the chair where she had left it at the beginning of the evening, and she put it on button by button. Then she opened the front door and stepped outside into the cold Chicago air, and the door closed behind her without a sound. She did not look back. Not because she was performing. Not to make a point for anyone still watching through the window. She did not look back because there was nothing in that house she had forgotten to take, and nothing in it she still needed. Julian had told her to leave, and she had decided 4 years ago that when that moment finally came, she would be the kind of woman who already knew where she was going. Julian stood in his living room and looked at the envelope on the table. The room had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet of something already over. He picked up the envelope. Inside were pages she had already signed. Inside was a woman's answer to the question he thought he was asking, which turned out not to be the question she had heard at all. He had meant to ask her to stay. She had understood it as permission to go. And in the time it took him to read the first page, the car Camille had called from the stairs of the house was already crossing the bridge, heading toward a penthouse in Streeterville, toward a life that had been quietly assembling itself for 4 years in the margins of the one he thought he controlled. Julian set the papers down. He said nothing. There was no one left to perform for. Julian Caruso was not a man who lost things. He had built his entire life around that fact, around the certainty that what belonged to him stayed where he placed it. So, when the morning after the party arrived, and Camille did not call, did not appear at the breakfast table, did not send any message asking to discuss what had happened, he told himself it was temporary. Women who had nowhere to go came back. That was simply the logic of the situation. He gave it 2 days before he called Grant Keegan. Grant was the kind of man Julian kept at a certain distance, useful, discreet, expensive enough to be trustworthy, but never invited to the table where the real decisions were made. He had handled sensitive situations for the organization before, quiet things that needed to disappear or quiet people who needed to be located. Finding out what a recently separated wife had been doing with her time seemed, to Julian, like a small assignment. He expected Grant to return with evidence of something manageable, money she had borrowed from the household accounts, a financial dependency she had concealed, some thread he could pull to demonstrate that her independence was a performance funded by his infrastructure. He was not prepared for what Grant actually found. It took Grant 11 days to produce his first real report. He came to Julian's office on a Thursday morning and set a folder on the desk without preamble. Inside was the outline of something Julian had no framework for. A consulting firm registered under a name he did not recognize, incorporated 4 years earlier, with a client list that included 3 mid-sized real estate development companies and a private equity firm out of Boston. The firm was called Claire Storm. The registered agent was a woman named Marina Reeves. The beneficial owner, documented through a holding structure that had taken Grant's forensic accountant considerable effort to untangle, was Camille. Julian read the folder twice. He had told rooms full of powerful men that his wife had never managed a business. He had said it with the ease of someone stating a fact so obvious it required no evidence. And for 9 years, Camille had allowed him to believe it, had sat at those tables and smiled at those remarks, and had gone home and continued building something he was only now reading about in a private investigator's report. The discomfort that moved through Julian in that moment was not guilt. It was something closer to vertigo, the sensation of a man who has been certain of the ground beneath him, discovering the ground was somewhere else entirely. He instructed Grant to keep going. He told himself he was looking for the angle, the flaw, the place where her independence connected back to his money. If she had used household funds to seed the company, he had leverage. If she had transferred assets without disclosure, he had a legal argument. He needed there to be a thread, because a thread meant he still held the end of it. But the more Grant dug, the cleaner the picture became. Claire Storm had been built from a loan Marina had structured through a private credit line, repaid in full within 2 years. The real estate portfolio had been acquired through proceeds the company generated. The Streeterville penthouse had been purchased through a separate holding entity 18 months ago. Every piece of it was separate from Julian. Every piece of it was hers. He had watched her sleep. He had assumed she was sleeping. It was Grant who eventually asked the question that Julian had been circling for 2 weeks without landing on it. He asked, in the measured tone of a professional who understood that the answer was going to be difficult, whether Julian had ever actually paid attention to what his wife did between 8 in the morning and noon on weekdays. Julian said nothing. Grant closed his notebook and said he would be in touch if anything else surfaced, and he left Julian sitting with the file in a silence that had a very specific shape. The anonymous messages started reaching Camille around the same time, brief, specific, stripped of any identifying language. One said that Grant had located Marina. Another said the holding LLC had been identified. A third told her that by the following day, Julian would have a complete picture of her financial structure. Camille read each message carefully and tried to determine the source because she did not have allies inside Julian's circle, or so she had believed. She had been careful never to recruit anyone from his world. The messages did not read like a trap. They read like someone who knew what was coming and had decided, at some cost to themselves, that she should know too. She found out the truth through Owen. Her younger brother had called 3 times in the 10 days since she left the North Shore house, and she had not returned the calls. Owen had a quality that had always complicated her feelings about him. He was genuinely warm, genuinely well-intentioned, and genuinely incapable of protecting himself from his own decisions. He had borrowed money from people he should not have borrowed from, accumulated obligations he could not meet, and arrived at a place 8 months earlier where someone had offered to make the problem disappear in exchange for something small. The someone was Julian. The something small was access to his sister. Owen came to the Streeterville penthouse on a Wednesday evening and told her everything without being asked, which was the only honest thing he could have done with it by that point. He had met with Julian's people monthly. He had reported on Camille's schedule, her associates, her general demeanor. Nothing he thought could be used as a weapon, only the texture of her days, which he told himself was harmless. Until the afternoon, he had photographed a financial document on her laptop during a Sunday visit and handed the image to Julian's attorney, and then watched, from the outside, as the machinery of what Julian intended to do with that information became clear. Camille listened to all of it. She sat across from her brother in the living room of the penthouse she had bought with money she earned while he was reporting on her movements, and she listened without interruption because she needed to hear the full shape of it before she decided what to do with the shape. Owen had sent the anonymous warnings. He had also, in the weeks prior, fed Grant's investigation a series of false document trails that had slowed the timeline by nearly 3 weeks, enough time for Camille to consult her attorney, enough time to make a decision about what came next. It was imperfect restitution. She knew that. It did not make the original betrayal smaller, but it meant she was sitting here informed rather than ambushed, which was at least something. After Owen left, Camille called Marina. They spoke for 40 minutes. Then Camille called her attorney and made an appointment for the following morning because she had understood, sitting across from her brother, that hiding was no longer the correct strategy. Julian now had enough of the picture to use the discovery process in the divorce proceedings to force Claire Storm's financials into the open, client lists, revenue records, the full valuation of the company. He could not necessarily win that argument in court, but he could make the argument take 2 years, and 2 years of open litigation would do to Claire Storm what Julian had spent 9 years trying to do to Camille herself. It would reduce it. The smartest thing she could do was not hide the thing he was trying to expose. The smartest thing was to walk it into the light herself, on her own terms, before he could frame the narrative. Her attorney filed a voluntary disclosure of all assets the following week. Claire Storm, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts, the Streeterville penthouse, all of it named and documented and submitted before Julian's legal team could construct the argument that she had been concealing marital assets. It was a move that required her to show her hand entirely, which felt for approximately 48 hours like a catastrophic miscalculation. But Camille had learned from 4 years of building something in secret that transparency, chosen deliberately, was a form of power that secrecy could never be. She was done living by Julian's rules, and one of Julian's rules was that information was leveraged to be hoarded. She had decided she no longer needed that particular rule. The disclosure dismantled Julian's primary legal strategy, which enraged him in a way that his attorneys witnessed and privately noted with some concern. Around this time, Anthony Rizzo came to speak with him. Anthony had been with the Caruso organization for more than 30 years. Not an enforcer, not an attorney, but something harder to replace. A man whose judgment Julian had trusted in the way that you trust geography, as something simply present and reliable. Anthony said what he had apparently been deciding whether to say for some time. He told Julian that Camille had done nothing wrong. He said that Julian had treated her for the better part of a decade as something to be managed rather than someone to be known. And that when she had finally demonstrated the courage to leave, Julian's first instinct had been to find a way to punish her for it. He said all of this in a level voice without raising it, the way men speak when they have already accepted the consequences. Julian removed him from the organization that afternoon. And then he sat in his office for a long time because Anthony's words had the particular quality of true things. They do not stop after they have been said. His attorneys found their new angle within the week. There was a consulting contract that connected Owen to Claire Storm, a brief arrangement from 2 years earlier, before Owen's entanglement with Julian, when Camille had used her brother's signature on a small vendor agreement. It was technically nothing, but Julian's legal team filed a motion demanding full discovery of Claire Storm's financials on the basis of that contract. And the motion had enough structural logic that Camille's attorney gave her an honest assessment. They could fight it. Fighting it would take 18 months, possibly longer. The company's books would be open for that entire period. Clients who valued confidentiality might reconsider the relationship. The company's valuation, calculated mid-litigation, could be treated as a marital asset, even if the underlying argument was eventually rejected. None of this was certain, but none of it was impossible. Julian arranged to meet Camille outside her attorney's building on a Tuesday morning. He stood on the sidewalk and offered her a choice with the same pleasant calm he had used on the night of the party. She could settle with him now, a significant payment, immediate, clean, or he would pursue discovery until the courts forced Claire Storm open. And then they would divide whatever remained under the standard rules of marital property. And she could spend the next 2 years watching a company she had built in stolen hours become a line item in a legal dispute. He said it without heat, because he had learned that the most effective threats were the ones delivered as simple statements of fact. Camille stood on that sidewalk and looked at the man who had once told a room full of people she would not survive a week without him. She understood something she had not quite articulated before. That even if she won every legal argument, if winning required her to spend 2 more years inside Julian's orbit, then she had not actually left. She had just moved the fight to a different room. 4 years of building, and she would hand 2 more to him for the privilege of proving a point he would never fully concede anyway. She told him she would be in touch. She went upstairs. She sat at the conference table in her attorney's office and looked out the window at a city she had navigated quietly and without credit for 9 years. Then she picked up her phone and said 4 words that committed her to a direction she had not fully chosen until that moment. Get Julian in the room. Her hand was completely steady when she said it. But when she set the phone down and the attorney stepped out to make the arrangements, Camille pressed both palms flat against the cold surface of the conference table because, for the first time in 4 years, the plan she had constructed with such care was about to be decided not by what she had built, but by what she was willing to let go of. The meeting had been arranged for a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 34th floor of a building in the Loop that belonged to neither of their attorneys. Neutral ground, which was the only kind of ground Camille was willing to stand on anymore. She arrived 8 minutes early and took the seat that faced the door because she had spent 9 years sitting with her back to the room, and she was done with that particular arrangement. The city spread out below the floor-to-ceiling windows, gray and enormous and indifferent, the way Chicago looked in November when the lake pushed cold air through every gap in the skyline. She had always loved it for exactly that quality. It did not care who you were or what your husband had told people about you. Julian arrived alone, which surprised her. He was a man who moved through the world with infrastructure, attorneys, associates, the ambient weight of people who owed him things. But he came through the door by himself and sat down across from her without the performance she had been bracing for. And something in that absence of theater told her the next hour was going to be different from everything that had come before it. His attorney had communicated a settlement figure the previous afternoon that was significantly lower than the number Julian had named on the sidewalk outside her building 2 weeks earlier. Camille's attorney had called it a serious offer, which in legal language meant it was real. But Camille had not agreed to this meeting to accept a number. She had agreed to it because she needed to understand the reason for the number, and she had learned in 4 years of building a business that understanding the reason for a thing was always more useful than the thing itself. She asked him directly. She said the figure his attorney sent was not what she expected, and she wanted to know why it had changed. Julian looked at the table for a moment, then looked at her in a way she did not have a category for, because it was not the look of a man preparing a strategy. It was the look of a man who had been somewhere uncomfortable and was still carrying it with him. He told her that Grant's final report had included something beyond the financial summary. It had included a timeline, a detailed month-by-month accounting of what Camille had been doing for 4 years, reconstructed from documents and interviews and records that Grant's team had assembled. Julian said he had read it in his office on a Sunday afternoon, and then he had not left the office until Tuesday morning. What the timeline showed was not a scheme. It showed a woman who woke before 4 in the morning to work on a company she could not discuss with anyone in her daily life. It showed client calls taken from parking structures and hotel lobbies during gaps in a schedule that Julian had always believed he controlled entirely. It showed a woman who had built something real and consequential and genuinely difficult while maintaining, without a single visible seam, the appearance of the life her husband required her to inhabit. Julian told Camille that he had read every page of it, and that somewhere in the reading he had arrived at a question he could not answer, which was how a man could live with someone for 9 years and never once think to ask what she was actually capable of. Camille listened to all of this without filling the space he left around it. She had waited a long time to hear something like this, and she was not going to rush it or redirect it or make it easier for him by responding before he had finished. Julian said that he had treated her like furniture. He said it plainly, without softening it, and the plainness of it was more than she had expected from him. He said he had confused control with care and possession with love, and that on the night he told her to beg him to keep her, he had believed he was demonstrating how much she needed him. What he understood now was that he had only been demonstrating how little he had ever truly seen her. He was not asking her to come back. He said that too, clearly and without drama. He was not offering promises or describing the man he could become with sufficient motivation. He said he simply wanted her to know that he had finally understood what he had done and what he had lost in the doing of it, because it seemed important that she know that someone in this story had eventually been paying attention. Camille let his words settle into the room before she answered. She had rehearsed a version of this conversation many times over 4 years, in the early mornings when she was tired and the work was hard, and she needed something to hold on to. In those rehearsals, she had said all the things that would have satisfied a particular kind of justice. But sitting across from Julian in that conference room, she found that the speech she had prepared was not what came out of her. She told him she had never needed his promises. What she had needed was his respect, and she had needed it years ago when it could have changed the direction of things. She told him she had needed to be known by the person she was married to, not managed by him, not displayed by him, not quietly diminished by him in front of rooms full of people who would remember it long after the dinner ended. She said all of this without raising her voice because she did not need volume. She had the room. Julian received it without defending himself, which was the most dignified thing he could have done with it. The settlement terms were negotiated by their attorneys over the following hour, while Camille and Julian remained at the table without speaking much, the way people sit when the significant things have already been said and everything remaining is administrative. Before the attorneys returned with the final language, Camille added one condition to the agreement that had not been discussed in any prior communication. She said that Anthony Rizzo was to be reinstated to his position in the organization with all prior standing restored, and that this condition was non-negotiable and would be written into the final document. Julian looked at her for a moment, then said he would see to it personally. She told him she preferred it in writing. He agreed. 11 days later, Camille signed the dissolution paperwork in her attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon. The signing took less than 15 minutes. Nearly a decade of marriage reduced to the act of a pen moving across prepared lines, which was its own kind of truth about what the marriage had become long before she packed those 2 bags. Her attorney offered a brief remark about finality and next steps. Camille thanked her and walked out into the corridor and took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out onto Michigan Avenue. And the cold hit her face, and the city moved around her at its usual indifferent pace, and she stood there for a moment simply breathing it in. She called Marina from the sidewalk. Marina answered on the second ring and said nothing when Camille told her it was done. Just made a sound that contained everything a long friendship can compress into a single exhale. They agreed to meet for dinner the following week. There was a conversation about a new client, a real estate group in Denver that had been circling Claire Storm for 3 months and was ready to commit. Camille said she would look at the proposal tomorrow. Marina said good, because the proposal was excellent, and she had already told them as much, which was exactly the kind of decision Camille had trusted her to make independently. That was how they worked. That was how it had always worked from the beginning. In the months that followed, the penthouse in Streeterville was transformed by degrees from a tactical position into something that simply felt like a place where she lived. The last of the items she had kept in a storage unit, books, pieces of art, objects that had belonged to her before the marriage and had waited patiently in climate-controlled darkness for her to have somewhere to put them, arrived on a Saturday morning in February, carried in by 2 men who arranged them where she pointed and left without fanfare. She spent the afternoon moving things from where she had initially placed them to where they actually belonged, which was a process she had not been able to engage in for 9 years, because belonging had always been Julian's decision to make. Owen began a treatment program in January. It was the 4th one he had attempted, and Camille was not naive enough to treat this one as a conclusion rather than a development. But she had answered his last 2 calls, and she had met him for coffee once in a public place for 40 minutes, and they had talked about small things. His progress, a book he was reading, a memory from childhood that had surfaced and that they had both laughed at without needing to explain why it was funny. She had not forgiven him completely, because forgiveness was not a switch, but a direction, and she was simply facing that direction now, rather than away from it. The door between them was not open, but it was no longer locked from her side. Anthony Rizzo was reinstated to his position within the organization as Julian had promised and as the agreement required. Camille heard this from a mutual contact rather than from Julian directly, which was appropriate. Julian did not reach out to her after the signing, and she did not reach out to him. And the absence of contact was not uncomfortable. It was simply the correct distance for two people who had said what needed to be said and had nothing left to negotiate, standing at the window of the Streeterville penthouse on a February evening, watching the city lights organize themselves against the dark water of the lake. Camille thought about the night Julian had issued his ultimatum. She thought about the crowd of men who had been in the room, most of whom she would never encounter again, and what they had witnessed without understanding what they were seeing. They had seen a wife being given an ultimatum. They had not seen a woman being handed the exact moment she had been constructing a doorway toward for 4 years. Julian had believed he was demonstrating power. He had believed those words, "Beg me or get out," were the kind of words that collapsed the space around a person and left them with no options. But Camille had already made every option available to herself before he said them. The words had not opened a trap, they had opened a door. And the difference between those two things was everything. She had walked through it. She had not looked back. Not because she was making a statement for an audience, and not because she felt nothing. She had felt a great deal. In the months since, at unexpected moments and inconvenient times, the way grief surfaces when it is ready, rather than when you are. But she had not looked back, because she had known, with the clarity that comes from 4 years of patient, exhausting, invisible work, exactly where she was going. A life that had not been handed to her, not negotiated for her, not permitted by anyone. It had simply been built quietly in the margins by a woman her husband had told a room full of people would not survive a week without him. He had been wrong about the week. He had been wrong about most of it. And the most valuable thing Julian Caruso had ever given her was the one thing he had not meant to give at all, the absolute certainty, delivered in front of witnesses who would remember it, that it was time to go.